There's a certain kind of sound that only one man could pull from a guitar, a deep, aching bend that felt like it came from somewhere far beneath the surface. Long before the world called him a legend, Albert King stood under dim stage lights, carving out a voice that was as raw as it was unmistakable. How does a self-taught left-handed player, born into uncertainty and shaped by hardship, rise to become one of the most influential blues figures in American music? And why did it take so long for the world to truly recognize the depth of what he gave? This is the story of Albert King. Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea. Sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the world knew his name, before the stages, before the long, aching bends that would define an entire generation of guitar players, Albert King was simply a boy trying to find his place in a world that offered him very little. His beginnings were wrapped in mystery. Even his birth year and birthplace shifted depending on the document or the moment. Some sources point to Indianola, Mississippi, while others list Aberdeen. What remained consistent was the uncertainty. He was born Albert Nelson, and the details surrounding those early years reflected the unstable reality of African-American life in the Deep South during that time. Hardship wasn't something he encountered later in life. It was the soil he grew out of. He grew up in an era when opportunity rarely made its way into black communities, especially in rural Mississippi. Families worked hard, lived harder, and carried their hopes quietly. For Albert, music wasn't a luxury, it was a lifeline. He didn't have the means to own an instrument, so he built one for himself, a makeshift guitar fashioned from a cigar box, broom wire, and whatever scraps he could find. In that simple, homemade creation, he discovered something powerful, the sound of his own voice. Not the sound he would later sing with, but the voice hidden in those strings, the one that seemed to speak for him when nothing else could. Albert's earliest musical experiences came through gospel. The church was the center of community life, and the harmony of voices offered comfort that day-to-day struggles could not. He joined a gospel group called the Harmony Kings and found himself drawn to the purity of the sound. Gospel taught him structure, discipline, and emotion, three qualities that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Yet, as much as he respected the spiritual foundation of gospel, he felt something shifting inside him when he heard the blues. The first time he listened to Blind Lemon Jefferson or Lonnie Johnson, something clicked. Blues reflected the truth of the life he knew, the pain, the resilience, the longing, the unspoken conversations between struggle and survival. The music wasn't polished. It wasn't meant to be. It was honest. And that honesty called to him. Little by little, gospel faded into the background, and blues took its place at the center of his world. During those years, the South was changing, but not fast enough. Segregation shaped the environment Albert grew up in, limiting dreams before they ever had the chance to take form. Yet somehow, music slipped past those barriers. Blues clubs became sanctuaries for expression, places where men and women carved out a few hours to forget the weight they carried. Albert wanted to be part of that world, not in the shadows, but standing in the light, guitar in hand. In 1950, the path toward that dream began to take shape when he met M.C. Reeder, the owner of the T99 nightclub in Osceola, Arkansas. Reeder encouraged him to move to Osceola, and Albert took the chance. It was a small step, but it changed everything. In Osceola, he joined the house band, the In the Groove Boys. It was here that he first felt the power of a real audience responding to him. The crowds weren't big, but the connection was real. Each night on that stage was another lesson not only in music, but in confidence. The way he played guitar wasn't like anyone else. Because he was left-handed and self-taught, he simply flipped a right-handed guitar upside down. Most players would have restrung it, but Albert didn't. The thick bass strings were on the bottom instead of the top, forcing him to develop a bending technique that was uniquely his. Where other guitarists pushed strings down, he pulled them up with force, stretching them until they cried out with a sharp, emotional wail. That sound, fierce, soulful, unmistakable, began right there, long before fame ever found him. Life in Arkansas gave him stability, but it also pushed him to dream bigger. He performed at radio stations, local clubs, and rooms filled with cigarette smoke and the hum of conversation. People weren't just listening, they were noticing. His tone was rough, his phrasing deliberate, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had lived twice as long as he had. By the early 1950s, it was clear he wasn't meant to stay in one town. He was meant to roam and to grow. Every great artist begins with a moment when life offers a choice. Stay where things are familiar or chase something that might change everything. For Albert King, that moment came quietly, not with a burst of luck or a dramatic turn, but with the steady realization that the world was larger than the small rooms he played in. With nothing but his guitar, his voice, and a belief that he had something to offer, he took another step into uncertainty. The road ahead would be long, unpredictable, and filled with more struggle than success. But before the fame, before the influence, before the legend, there was simply a man willing to try, and that was enough to set everything into motion. By the early 1950s, Albert King understood that talent alone wouldn't carry him where he needed to go. He had the sound, he had the hunger, but he needed a stage larger than the ones he'd found in Arkansas. That opportunity came when he moved north to Gary, Indiana, a city swelling with factories, newcomers, and the restless energy of people searching for a better life. Gary wasn't glamorous, but for musicians, it was alive. Clubs stayed open late, and the air carried the hum of guitars and laughter spilling out onto crowded streets. It was here that Albert crossed paths with two musicians who would shape his early development, Jimmy Reed and John Brim. Both men were known for their guitar work, which left Albert in an unexpected position. Since Reed and Brim already handled the guitar duties, Albert ended up behind the drum kit. It wasn't what he wanted, but it taught him something essential, the heartbeat of the music. Night after night, as he held the rhythm steady, he learned how a song breathed. He listened to how Reed bent his notes and how Brim phrased his chords. Even though he wasn't holding a guitar, every beat helped refine the timing and conviction that would become signatures of his future sound. In late 1953, a new door opened. Willie Dixon, the legendary bassist and songwriter, saw potential in Albert and helped him land an audition with Parrot Records. Dixon had an ear for greatness, and what he heard in Albert was raw power, not polished, not commercial, but deeply real. Albert passed the audition, and within months he recorded his first session for the label. 5 songs were captured, but only one single was released, Be On Your Merry Way. It didn't make him a household name, but it marked the beginning of his recording journey. Bad Luck Blues followed, hinting at the emotional heaviness that would define his best work. The singles didn't take off beyond regional success, and Parrot didn't call him back. Many musicians would have felt defeated, but Albert had lived through too much hardship to let a quiet phone stop him. He packed up, returned to Osceola, and rejoined the In the Groove Boys. Some might have seen it as a step backward, but Albert used the time to sharpen his identity. His tone grew stronger, his attack more assertive. Each show was another rehearsal for the moment he knew would eventually come. By 1956, the road led him to St. Louis, a city that pulsed with blues, jazz, and the restless creativity of working-class artists trying to carve out something of their own. St. Louis was where Albert began to feel like more than a sideman. The clubs welcomed him, the crowds recognized him, and the energy pushed him forward. His reputation grew quickly. By late 1956, he wasn't just performing, he was headlining. This phase of his career marked the transition from promising musician to rising force. He had no agent, no marketing, no big label machine behind him. What he did have was presence, a tall, imposing man with a flying V guitar played upside down and a voice that could cut through the noise of any room. His sound didn't blend in, it stood apart. In the late 1950s, he signed with Bobbin Records, a small St. Louis-based label that gave him something he had been waiting for, space to put his guitar at the center of the music. His first releases with Bobbin featured horns and a jump blues feel, but it was Albert's guitar, sharp, soulful, unmistakable, that listeners gravitated toward. The seeds were planted. The world didn't know it yet, but Albert King was on the edge of something bigger, much bigger. As the 1950 turned into the early 1960, Albert King stood on the edge of something he had chased for more than a decade: recognition. He had already built a solid reputation in St. Louis, and the local scene embraced him as a rising figure with a sound unlike anything else on the circuit. But what he needed was a breakthrough, something strong enough to cut through the noise of the crowded blues landscape and earn him a place beyond the Midwest. That moment finally arrived when he released Don't Throw Your Love on Me So Strong. Issued in late 1961 and later leased by King Records for national distribution, the single had everything Albert had been slowly shaping: the raw force of his bends, the grit in his voice, and the emotional weight that seemed to sit on every note he played. When the song climbed to number 14 on the R&B charts, it marked the first time he truly broke into the national conversation. For Albert, this wasn't just a hit, it was validation. After years of being overlooked, pushed aside, or told to stay in the background, people were finally listening, but success rarely arrives without complication. His follow-up sessions with King Records leaned toward a more polished, pop-oriented sound, and the singles didn't connect with the audience. The label had misunderstood what made Albert unique. They tried to shape him into something smoother, softer, something he wasn't. And just as fast as the door had opened, it closed. Still, Albert was used to rebuilding. He shifted back to smaller labels, recording 4 songs for the local Count label under bandleader Leo Gooden. The tracks were strong, soulful, guitar-driven, and rooted in the blues he knew best. But personal tensions and jealousy within the label caused problems. Despite the songs selling well in street, Louis Gooden became resentful of Albert's success and cut him loose. It was another setback, another moment when the industry failed to understand what he had to offer. But setbacks had never been enough to break him. Instead, they pushed him further toward the sound he had been forming quietly, steadily. For years, the sound that would eventually define him. That transformation accelerated in 1966, when Albert joined Stax Records in Memphis. Stax wasn't just another label. It was the beating heart of Southern soul, home to Booker T. and the MGs, Otis Redding, Isaac Hayes, and a roster of musicians who understood the power of groove as deeply as Albert understood the blues. From the moment he stepped into the Stax studio, something clicked. His guitar didn't clash with the rhythm and blues arrangements. It lifted them. His bends sliced through the smooth horn lines. His tone added tension to the warm, soulful backing, and his personality fused perfectly with the Memphis sound. This was not an accident. Stax was the first label to truly see Albert for what he was: a blues innovator, not a background musician. They let him lead. They let his guitar stand front and center. And with the MGs supporting him, Albert finally had the musical foundation he needed to show the full range of his ability. The turning point wasn't a single session or a single song. It was the alignment of timing, talent, and the right people in the right room. The Stax roster understood how to build space around a dominant guitar voice. They knew how to let Albert's tone breathe, how to let a riff sit in the air long enough to hit the audience straight in the chest. And the world noticed. Rock musicians, especially those in the rising British blues scene, were paying attention. Eric Clapton dissected Albert's phrasing note by note. Jimi Hendrix studied the way Albert controlled volume, tone, and emotion with such minimal movement. Stevie Ray Vaughan later said there would be no SRV sound without Albert King. Albert had finally stepped into the light he had been chasing since the days of his homemade cigar box guitar. He wasn't a sideman anymore. He wasn't a regional act. He had become a force, the kind of musician whose presence changed the atmosphere of a room the moment he touched a string. The climb had been long. The recognition had come late. But in Memphis, Albert King found not just a label, but a home, and the beginning of the legacy that would follow him for the rest of his life. By the time Albert King settled into the Stax Records family, the musical world around him was changing fast, and for the first time, the change worked in his favor. The Memphis air carried a mix of blues, soul, and rhythm that blended effortlessly into something fresh, something bigger than any single genre. And right in the center of that movement stood Albert, gripping his upside-down flying V like it was made for him and him alone. In 1967, Stax released the album that would change everything, Born Under a Bad Sign. It wasn't just a collection of songs. It was a declaration bold, gritty, and carved directly from the deepest corners of Albert's life. The title track became an anthem, its opening riff instantly recognizable, its lyrics echoing the struggle and resilience of a man who'd lived every word. Cross-Cut Saw followed, showcasing a level of finesse and aggression in his bends that most players couldn't replicate even with both hands on the neck. For the first time, Blues wasn't just being preserved, it was being reborn. Albert's tone sharp, commanding, unmistakably his cut through the smooth horns and warm grooves crafted by Booker T and the MGs. The band wasn't backing him, they were elevating him, giving his guitar room to roar and whisper with equal intensity. The result was a sound that hadn't existed before, a perfect fusion of soulful Memphis rhythm and raw Mississippi Delta emotion. Audiences heard it immediately, critics heard it. Most importantly, musicians heard it. Across the ocean, the British blues explosion was in full swing, and guitarists studying American records were struck by how strange and powerful Albert's playing was. The way he pulled the strings upward, bending them far beyond what seemed possible, gave his solos a haunting vocal quality that guitarists like Eric Clapton, Peter Green, and Rory Gallagher tried endlessly to imitate. And then there was Jimi Hendrix. Those who knew Hendrix well often said he admired Albert's phrasing more than almost any other guitarist. The fierce confidence, the sharp attack, the quiet spaces between the notes Albert had shaped a form of expression that Hendrix carried into his own revolutionary sound. Years later, Stevie Ray Vaughan would openly call Albert his foundation, crediting him for the intensity and emotional fire at the center of his music. But the praise didn't stay in the studio. On stage, Albert became something different, not just a guitarist, but a presence. When he walked out under the lights, tall, broad-shouldered, and holding his left-handed guitar the wrong way, he commanded a room before playing a single note. And when he finally did play, the crowd knew they were hearing something they wouldn't hear from anyone else. His performances at the Fillmore West in San Francisco in 1968 showed how far his influence had spread. Young rock fans, many of whom had grown up on the new sound of electric guitar, stood shoulder to shoulder, listening to a man who had shaped the very music they loved, even if they didn't know it yet. The Live Wire, divided by Blues Power album, captured that moment perfectly, showing Albert in full command of the stage, bending strings until they seemed ready to snap, pouring his entire spirit into every song. This was his peak, not because he finally reached fame, but because the world finally caught up to what he had been offering all along. Albert King wasn't just playing the blues, he was defining its future. Even in the glow of his greatest success, there were shadows gathering around Albert King, shadows he didn't ignore, but couldn't escape either. At Stax, he had finally found a musical home that understood him, a place where his guitar wasn't treated as an accessory but as the beating heart of the music. Yet the industry itself was changing, and with every year that passed, the world around Albert grew more complicated. Fame came late for him, and recognition even later. But expectations arrived immediately. Suddenly, everyone wanted Albert King to sound like Albert King perfectly, consistently, endlessly. He felt the pressure every time he stepped into the studio. There was a quiet tension beneath the surface. Stax needed hits, the market demanded crossover success, and rock audiences, many of them young, white, and newly discovering blues, saw Albert as a symbol rather than a man. They loved the sound, the power, the bending strings, but few understood the years of pain, poverty, and rejection that had shaped his tone. In crowded rooms and smoky halls, he gave them everything he had. But once the applause faded, he often returned to the uneasy truth that his place in the industry was still fragile. At the same time, the musicians he inspired were rising fast. Eric Clapton was selling millions. Jimi Hendrix was rewriting the future of the electric guitar. Bands across America and Europe were building careers on a sound rooted in the very techniques Albert had crafted through years of solitude and survival. And yet, Albert remained caught in the middle, admired, respected, even idolized, but not rewarded on the same scale. He wasn't bitter, but he wasn't blind either. He knew how the industry worked. He knew which artists were given marketing budgets, magazine covers, and radio promotion, and which ones weren't. When rock musicians covered his songs or quoted his licks, they became celebrated innovators. When Albert did the same work, he was labeled a bluesman, important, but confined. It was an invisible line the industry had drawn long before he arrived, and no amount of talent could fully erase it. Meanwhile, Stax Records was facing its own internal storms. Financial cracks were forming within the label. The music business was shifting toward a more commercial sound, and distributors were tightening their control. Stax leaned heavily on its biggest names, and Albert felt the weight of the company's struggles pressing into his recording sessions. Even when the music was good, sometimes incredible, there was a sense that something was slipping. On stage, none of this showed. He walked out with confidence, with fire in his hands, and he played as if each night mattered more than the last. But offstage, he worried. Blues had never been a genre that guaranteed long-lasting success, and the market was moving faster toward trends that had little room for older musicians. The very rock artists he influenced were helping redefine the sound of young America, and audiences often followed them instead of returning to the source. By the early 1970s, Albert began to feel the first signs of distance forming between him and the mainstream. Stax pushed for more crossover potential, hinting at slicker production and softer edges. The rawness that made Albert King who he was, the sharp bends, the vocal-like phrasing, the weight of his tone didn't always fit with the direction the label wanted. His music was still powerful, still unmistakable, but it was becoming harder to keep his identity intact while navigating the commercial pressures placed on him. And beneath it all lay a quieter truth, the kind of truth artists rarely say aloud. When you've spent your life carving out a sound that comes from the deepest parts of who you are, the fear of fading into silence becomes harder to bear. Albert King had reached his peak, but the cracks around him were beginning to show. What he didn't know then was that the hardest years were still on the way. By the early 1970s, the world Albert King had fought so hard to break into was shifting again, only this time, it wasn't shifting toward him. Stax Records, the label that had given him the creative space he needed, was sinking into deep financial trouble. Internal disputes, distribution issues, and mounting debts pushed the company to the edge. For Albert, this wasn't just a business problem. It was the collapse of the musical foundation he had finally found after years of searching. When Stax fell, it didn't just take jobs with it. It took stability, identity, and the sense of belonging Albert had built in Memphis. The studio where he crafted his most defining work suddenly felt like a memory. Without Stax, he was once again a musician drifting from label to label, a path he thought he had finally put behind him. He signed with Utopia, a small subsidiary of RCA, and although the new environment tried to push him toward a smoother, more commercially friendly soul sound, something about the music didn't feel like home. Albert played the notes, sang the words, but the spirit wasn't there. The grit, the ache, the raw honesty that made his blues resonate with so many people, it all felt muted. Financial pressures began to mount. The music industry had never been kind to blues musicians, and Albert had learned long ago that hit records didn't always mean secure paychecks. Touring became his lifeline. City after city, night after night, he went on the road to keep his income steady. It was exhausting work for a man whose body had absorbed the weight of decades of bending strings, gripping the neck of his guitar with fierce determination, and commanding stages with a presence that demanded everything from him. As he entered his 50s, age became another quiet enemy. Not in the dramatic sense, Albert was still powerful, still capable of electrifying a room, but he felt the toll more deeply. The hands that once bent strings to impossible heights stiffened quicker. The travel grew harder. The nights felt longer. But he kept going because he had to. Music wasn't just a passion, it was survival. At the same time, the audience itself was changing. Younger generations were exploring new styles, new sounds, and new trends. Rock was evolving. Soul was branching out, and disco was emerging as a dominant force. The blues, once the foundation on which so much American music was built, was no longer at the center of popular culture. Albert knew this. He heard it in the crowds, in the shifting tastes of promoters, in the way clubs booked their schedules. He wasn't forgotten, but he wasn't the priority he once was. There were personal moments of loneliness too, the kind that don't make headlines but leave a lasting mark. Being a pioneer meant being admired, but it didn't always mean being understood. The musicians he had influenced were thriving, celebrated, and financially secure, while Albert continued to live the life of a working musician, pushing through each tour date, each hotel room, each late-night drive to the next gig. This wasn't a dramatic downfall. It wasn't marked by scandal or public collapse. It was quieter than that, the kind of slow, grinding crisis that wears a person down over years. Albert King had built his legacy on determination, and he held on to that instinct even as the world around him shifted out of his reach. But beneath the professionalism, beneath the powerful stage presence, There was a man carrying the weight of uncertainty once again, and the silence between shows was beginning to feel louder than ever. When the cracks that had been forming around Albert King finally gave way, the consequences didn't arrive with noise or dramatic headlines. They came quietly, almost silently, in the form of smaller crowds, fewer radio plays, and an industry that moved forward without looking back. For a man who had shaped the sound of modern guitar music, the silence felt heavier than any hardship he had lived through before. After leaving Utopia, Albert drifted toward Tomato Records in the late 1970s. The label gave him room to play the blues on his own terms, but the industry had already shifted its spotlight to newer genres. Even when his music was strong, the market wasn't listening. For the first time in his life, his sound, the sound that had shaped legends, seemed to sit outside the center of American culture. Albert felt the distance growing, not because he had changed, but because the world around him had. He continued to tour because the stage was the one place where his worth still felt undeniable. In front of an audience, the years melted away. But once the lights dimmed and the crowd scattered into the night, the reality lingered. Promoters paid less, venues grew smaller, the travel became tougher. The business he had dedicated his life to was offering fewer rewards with each passing year. When he eventually moved to Fantasy Records in the early 1980s, he remained determined to play, to create, to stay connected to the music that had carried him from cigar box guitars to global influence. But the industry rarely prioritized blues artists of his generation. There were no big marketing budgets, no major tours, no promotional machines pushing his albums. He wasn't forgotten by fans, but he was increasingly overlooked by the system that should have championed him. And then there was the loneliness that comes for many older musicians, especially those who spent their lives on the road. Hotels began to feel colder. Days between shows grew longer. The people who once filled the rooms, managers, musicians, friends, slowly faded into different phases of their own lives. Albert kept going, but the road felt different now, quieter. The kind of quiet that makes a man question whether the world still hears him. Financially, he was never secure the way many believed. The musicians he had influenced, Clapton, Hendrix, Stevie Ray Vaughan, had reached heights that the architects of their sound rarely experienced. Albert didn't envy them, but he understood the imbalance. The world admired the student more than the teacher, and that truth stung in ways he never said aloud, yet he never stopped playing. Well into his 60s, he carried his Flying V onto stages across America and Europe, determined to give audiences the same intensity he had given decades earlier. His hands weren't as fast, and his body carried the weight of endless miles on the highway, but the soul in his playing never dimmed. Still, time has its own rhythm. In the end, the decline wasn't a collapse, it was a slow fade, the kind that happens when the world changes direction and leaves some of its greatest artists standing in the doorway, watching the crowd move on. Albert King kept going until his heart finally gave out on the 21st of December 1992. The stage lights dimmed and the silence returned, but this time, it wasn't his silence. It was the world's, realizing too late what it had lost. Albert King's legacy didn't fully settle into the public consciousness until years after his greatest work had already reshaped modern guitar music. What he left behind wasn't just a catalog of songs, it was a blueprint. His sound, his technique, and his emotional intensity became part of the DNA of blues and rock, carried forward by musicians who often didn't even realize they were borrowing from him. But those who studied the craft knew exactly where it came from. At the center of his legacy was his unmistakable style. Because he flipped his right-handed guitar upside down and never restrung it, Albert created a world of techniques no conventional player could naturally replicate. His bends were fierce and wide, pulling the strings upward with such force that the notes seemed to cry out. His phrasing was spacious, deliberate pauses, drawn-out tones, and sudden bursts of intensity that made every solo feel like a conversation between pain and pride. This wasn't technique for the sake of technique. It was storytelling. Born Under a Bad Sign became the anchor of his influence, a record that future generations treated almost like scripture. The title track alone introduced riffs and lines that guitarists across the world would study for decades. Crosscut Saw, with its sly rhythm and sharp bite, became a rite of passage for anyone attempting to understand blues phrasing. Even outside the studio, Albert's live performances added to his legend. The way he could command a room with a single bent note made him not just a musician, but an interpreter of emotion. His reach extended far beyond blues circles. Eric Clapton often cited him as one of the key architects of the modern electric guitar. Jimi Hendrix, known for his groundbreaking style, admired Albert's control and restraint qualities Hendrix incorporated into his own playing. Stevie Ray Vaughan carried Albert's influence like a torch, openly declaring that he built much of his technique on the foundation Albert created. Without Albert King, the sound of electric guitar in the second half of the century would be unrecognizable. And yet, his legacy wasn't only in what others learned from him. It lived in the values he represented: perseverance, authenticity, and the belief that music meant something deeper than commercial success. His blues carried the weight of generations, the stories of people who lived through hardship, and the voice of a man who never let circumstance dictate his worth. Albert King didn't just leave behind songs, he left behind a standard, a reminder of what it means to play with soul, truth, and a fire that refuses to fade. In the years after Albert King's passing, something remarkable began to happen. The world slowly started to understand just how much of itself it had heard through his guitar. What had once been overlooked or minimized became clearer with time. Critics revisited his recordings with a deeper lens. Musicians spoke more openly about the techniques they had borrowed from him, and younger generations began tracing the musical lineage of their heroes, only to find Albert standing quietly at the beginning of the path. In America, his recognition grew steadily. Blues scholars and archives highlighted his contributions with new urgency, pointing out that many of the sounds associated with rock guitar owed their existence to Albert's unconventional approach. Museums and music institutions began using his recordings as teaching material, not just for blues classes, but for studies in phrasing, tone, and emotional expression. The Blues Foundation formally honored him, acknowledging that his artistry had shaped the very core of American music. Beyond the United States, Europe embraced him with a kind of reverence that reflected how deeply British and European musicians had drawn from his playing. Guitar magazines published retrospectives analyzing his solos frame by frame. Documentary filmmakers used his life as a window into the evolution of electric blues. Festival organizers dedicated entire tribute nights to his memory, inviting guitarists from around the world to reinterpret the sound he had pioneered. But the reflection wasn't only about technique or history, it was about understanding the space Albert King held and how often that space had been underestimated. Fans who discovered him later in life often expressed disbelief that a musician so essential could have spent so many years fighting for recognition. His influence had been everywhere, yet he was rarely celebrated with the same spotlight given to the artists who followed in his footsteps. In that sense, his legacy became more than musical, it became symbolic. Albert King represented the countless artists whose foundational work shaped generations, even if the industry never gave them the full measure of their due. His name became a reminder that innovation doesn't always receive immediate reward sometimes. It waits patiently for the world to catch up. Today, Albert's music lives on not through nostalgia alone, but through relevance. Every guitarist who bends a note with intention, every musician who plays from a place of truth rather than trend, carries a piece of what he left behind. And in that quiet, enduring way, Albert King finally received what he had earned long ago. A place in the global memory of music, carved as deeply as the bends that once echoed from his fingertips. In the end, when you look back at the long road Albert King walked, you can still hear the echo of that first bending note, sharp, aching, and full of truth. It's the same sound that carried him from a homemade cigar box guitar to stages around the world. The same sound that outlived every moment when the industry tried to push him aside. Time has a way of revealing what truly matters. And with Albert, it revealed a legacy far larger than the recognition he received while he was here. When the lights fall on his story, you begin to understand that Albert King wasn't defined by charts or awards. He was defined by the way his music changed people, not loudly, not suddenly, but deeply. His influence slipped quietly into the hands of the greatest guitarists of the modern era, shaping the voice of an entire generation without ever asking for the credit. And maybe that's why his legacy feels so powerful now, because it wasn't built on fame, it was built on truth. Think back to that opening image, the dim stage, the low blue light, the sound of a single note bending its way into the air. That wasn't just a performance. It was a life story. A man who rose from uncertainty, shaped his own identity with his bare hands, and left the world with something no one else could ever replicate. Albert King gave the blues a new language, and he gave the guitar a new soul. And now, his story belongs to all of us, to remember, to honor, and to pass forward. So here's my question to you. Do you think Albert King ever received the respect he truly deserved? If this story touched you, take a moment to leave a comment for him below. Share your memories, your favorite songs, or how his music found its way into your life. And if you believe legends like Albert King should never fade from memory, hit that subscribe button and help us keep their light alive, one story, one song, one truth at a time.